Hi, everyone. This is Jeffery Giesener, founder of the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and YouTube. And I'm honored to have my friend Bonnie Growe. And Bonnie comes from the Growe family, which includes Mrs. Rachel Growe, who's a Holocaust survivor. But Bonnie also has survivors, is a child of both parents of survivors. So Bonnie, I want to kind of start this off by having you give us a little background about your mom and dad's pre-war experience, as well as what camps they were in, and if you have any stories about their camp. Well, then we'll move beyond the camps.
Okay, hi. Okay, well, actually, my mother was married. She was widowed twice and married 3 times. All 3 of her husbands were survivors. So very large survivor family. But my mother herself was born in Warsaw and came from the capital. She's the oldest of 4 children. And my grandparents were tailors. And my grandfather was also the principal of the local high school. And they were very prominent in the community. And I know from what my mother told me, of the stories that she told me, my grandparents, their main source of business was they used to make the uniforms for the Gentile children that went to school in Warsaw, which served to help them during the Warsaw Ghetto. When the ghetto was put together, my mother and her parents and her grandparents were put into the Warsaw Ghetto. And my mother was the oldest of 4, and she had blonde hair and hazel eyes. And a lot of people in town knew of my family, my mother's family. And they were, like I had said, they were very well to do. So what my mother told me they used to do was my grandfather would sell bolts of material, specifically wool, in the winter for the warmth. My mother there would be Gentile people on the outside of the walls of the ghetto who would help my mother get out. And my mother would take the bolts of wool and barter them for food to bring back into the ghetto for the family. And that was a big portion of the way that they survived. The whole family survived in the ghetto. My mother's grandparents and my grandfather and one of my brothers were shot and killed in the ghetto. And my mother, her sister, who was the youngest, and their mother were taken when the camp was dissolved. They were taken to the camps. My grandmother passed in Treblinka along with my mom's brother, and my mom and her sister survived. They were in 3 different camps. The most prominent one, or well-known, my mother was in Mydonic, and she and her sister and a cousin survived Mydonic. And after the liberation, after the death march, they went to Belgium. My mom, her then husband, who she was in the camp with, her sister and her husband, the 4 of them went to Belgium. Her cousin and her husband, they all got married. They did their own little civil service uniting in the DP camps after the war. And my mom's cousin and her husband went to Germany, where they all each had their firstborn. So my sister and my oldest brother were born in Namur, Belgium, and until they could get passage to come to the United States, which they did in 1949. And so I am the first American-born person in my family. They were all born in Europe after the liberation.
What about your father? What about your father?
Well, my mother's first husband passed away after they got to Detroit. He passed away. He was a cantor at a prominent conservative synagogue in the Detroit area. And he passed away of pancreatic cancer, leaving my mom, my sister, and my brother. And then my mother married my father. My father was actually born in Mogilev in Belarus. And depending on the year, it was either Russia or Poland, depending on when it was. And from the stories, I never knew my father. My father passed away when I was 11 months old.
Oh, wow.
But I went on a journey in the 2000s to find my father's history, because my mother didn't know my father very long. They were only married 24 months when my dad died. And she told me he was an only child. And I didn't believe that, because who in Europe had one child? So I went on a journey and I went through the Jewish Gen websites, and I met someone that helped me through the American Red Cross find a cousin in Israel, the only other living survivor. Well, actually the only living survivor of my father's family. And I did speak to him through his wife before he passed away. And what he told me of my father was that, yes, my father was an only child, and he was doted on by his mother and father. And he was quite a bit older than my mother. He was married and had a wife and 2 children when the war broke out, and the 3 of them were killed. And my father and his cousin, this gentleman in Israel, went into hiding. And for 23 months, they were hidden by a Gentile family on a farm, basically underground and in a barn for 23 months. And of course, we all know that there was money to be had if you told on a family that was hiding Jews. And a neighbor found out that that this Gentile family was hiding Jews, and they told, and the Nazis came and took my father and his cousin and sent them to the camps and killed the family that was hiding them.
Which camp was
So,
he in?
I'm sorry?
Which camp was he in?
My father, I have the paperwork. I'm not that familiar with the names of the camp unless I'm actually looking at it, but it was for a very short time before. I mean, I believe that he was only in like a holding DP camp, because it was at the end of the war until he came to the United States in the 40s.
Okay, so now and how did your mother get to the United States with your father, which passed away?
With her first husband. She was sponsored. She found out she had a cousin that was in Detroit, and they wrote, and they were sponsored by a family in Detroit. And they came by ship. My mother said that it took 3 weeks to get to the United States with my mother, her husband, and 2 babies. Basically, my brother was 9 months old and my sister was 3 years old when they came to the United States.
So, okay, so now I'm going to take you into your growing up with your mother and her being a survivor. So tell us about your growing up along with your 2 siblings, and how was it growing up in a survivor's home?
Awful. It was absolutely awful.
Okay. Can you give us some flavor to that?
Sure. Actually, after my father passed away, my mother got married to another survivor and had another child. So I had a younger brother as well. So there were 4 of us. I used to joke and say that Hitler had a seat at our kitchen table, because our whole life, my mother couldn't let it go. Our whole life revolved around the war and what it had done to her and what it had done to our family. And there are some, I know my mother-in-law doesn't like to talk about the war. It makes her very sad. It makes her want to cry. This is Rachel Growe I'm speaking of. But my mother was the complete opposite. My mother talked about it all the time. So on top of having a mother that dressed funny, that had an accent, she was very paranoid, and she was very superstitious, and she was very overprotective. I wasn't allowed to do anything. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. I wasn't allowed to participate in a lot of activities that my other friends did, because there weren't that many Jewish kids, and she would only let me be friends with the children of the other survivors that she knew.
So how did this manifest in issues with you growing up?
Well, I became very fearful. To this day, I'm going to be 65. And to this day, my biggest fear is, the holiday that I have the hardest time with is the 4th of July, for example. Because when I was a child, every year on the 4th of July, my mother would make us listen to the fireworks outside and tell me that they sound like bombs. This is what bombs sound like. I remember specifically having a snack before I went to bed on a TV tray in our living room when we lived in Detroit on the black and white TV. And a TV show came on TV about the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Uprising. And whenever a show came on specifically about Warsaw, since my mother was from Warsaw, she was glued to the TV because she was looking for reminders or streets or buildings or places that would have some kind of memory for her. And I remember I was 9 years old and I begged her to not make me watch it. And since I was having a snack, I threatened her and I told her that if she made me watch this TV show with her, I was going to throw up. And she didn't care. She said I had to watch it because that's my family, that's my history. And so I watched it and then I threw up all over the living room carpet.
And how about your siblings? Similar in nature?
My siblings, my siblings, my sister and I talk about it. She did not, from what my sister told me, she did not make any of my other siblings do the things that she made me do. She didn't make them watch the TV show. There's a very big age difference between all of us children because of all the marriages. So there's 9 years and 11 years between my older siblings, and there's 6 years between my younger sibling. So my older sister is 11 years older than I am, and she told me that my mother didn't make them watch those shows. She didn't push it on them. So I kind of grew up as an only child because I was right in the middle, and I didn't have a father, and at least one that I remembered. And so that was just where her focus was. Her focus was on showing me everything that reminded her of being young.
So how did you know, I'm very interested in intergenerational trauma from survivors. My parents never spoke, so I'm in completely the opposite camp. However, I've had nightmares my whole life, just to give you a sense that I would, in certain situations, especially when my work was not the best for me, and I would tip into waking up in the middle of the night from a nightmare, always the same, that I was being interrogated by the Gestapo in a building with a hot light. And I would wake up sometimes in such a sweat that I had to take a shower at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it was always the same dream. And I've had this dream pretty much from college on, though I can remember back several other incidents that I had all the way to the 5th grade, when the 5th grade teacher separated the good kids from the bad kids and put the good kids in the front of the class and the bad kids in the back of the class. And I refused to go to school, and I cried and I cried. My mom had to take me to talk to the principal. And it was very difficult because my mom didn't speak really good English at the time. But it was sort of this kind of separation where my mom was separated from her mother, and my mother lost her mother and her baby sister, Magda, age 8, on the first day of arrival when Magda was pointed to go to the left by Mengele, and her mother wouldn't let go of her hand, and they both were killed by gas on the day of arrival. So I think that I knew when I was much younger, when I was in my early, 5 or 6, my mom would take me to the Showa memorials, and I would see the bulldozers taking the bones into the pits and stuff, and it drove me absolutely crazy. And I always thought that it was me, that I was the only one who was having these nightmares. and it wasn't until I came to San Diego and met the second generation show group here that I started to realize that I wasn't alone, that when I spoke to people, there were 50 people at one event. And, people told me that their mothers and fathers spoke, and some told me they didn't speak. Some told me that they also had trauma, and some said no. So I have a big proponent of trying to because people listening to us speak are having the same kind of issues that you're speaking about. And many of them think that they were alone and that they're not part of this group that all have this trauma. So I want to take you a little bit, and you've now, I want to say, did you leave the house and go to school, or did you go, what happened to you? What the occupation did you create for yourself? Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, my mother had 2 girls and 2 boys, and she was of the belief that her sons had to go to school so that they could have careers, so that they could support families. And my mother wasn't a big proponent of spending money on her daughters to go to college, because they're going to get married and change diapers anyway. I think a very big part of that, which she never admitted to, was the fact that my stepfather, my mother basically had Social Security income for the 3 of us. And I think that was a very big part of why we didn't have a lot, because she had a new husband and she had a son with him. And I feel, even though she never said it, that she was using the Social Security money that she received for us, and it wasn't enough to go to college. And so my sister and I did not go to college. We both got married very young, and we got married very young. My mother always told us that we had to marry someone Jewish. If we didn't, she was going to sit Shiva for us. And we were very fearful of that. So we did exactly as she told us. And she also told me that she wanted me to marry someone American. She didn't want me to marry someone that came from the same history that I did, because she wanted me to have a better life. So basically, she picked my husband for me.
And who was that?
I'm sorry?
Who was that?
His name was Jeff, and he was an American Jew, born to 2 American Jewish parents from Detroit. And my mother.
When did you get married?
1977. My mother was very impressed with my mother-in-law, with the things she had, the material things she had, and the trips that she went on, and the clothes that she wore. And my mother said she wanted that for me. So she basically picked my husband for me, and she pushed me to get married, which I did.
How old were you?
19. And within the first year of my marriage, I was not happy. And I went back home, and she told me I couldn't come home again. She said, "You made your bed, now lie in it. Go back home." So I went back, and I had 2 children. And then I got divorced. So I was married for 13 years. And she was very upset with me when I filed for divorce. She was terribly upset with me. She said I was ruining my life. And, her whole big thing was, you have all the money you need. Why are you getting divorced? So I did. I got divorced, and I married a great guy who's a child of Holocaust survivors. And we've been together over 30 years. So
that is Steve.
Steve, correct. Yes.
And Steve Growe has also become a friend of myself, and he's attended some of the programs that I put on. And I really love how he treats his mom with such beautiful, such tenderness. It's quite nice to see, as well as all the Growes have such a respect for their mother, which I'm sad to hear the stories that you're sharing. So you had your children.
I did.
And how many children did you have with Steve?
I have no children with Steve.
I see. So Steve So just walk me through this. You have children
I
with
have
your first-
I have two children with my
Okay.
first husband, and Steve was married and he had three children with his first wife.
Okay, and then you got together and
We
did,
got together and we
and
made
you-
our family of 5 kids.
and did he adopt any of your children or no?
No,
Okay.
he did not.
Okay, and do they see Steve as a father figure?
Yes, yes.
That's
150%. He has been there for them since they were very young. We've been together over 30 years, and they go to him. They go to him for everything. He's dad. So
I'm going to ask you maybe a tough question. You're both are second gens. How is it living with each other as second gens? And you come from what seems to be different lineage. So how do you deal with your second gen issues?
we understand each other. We understand each other. I've told Steve things about my childhood that I never told my first husband, and I was with him for 15 years, which is not just, you know, a minute. Steve, we talk about our childhood. We talk about the things that our parents went through. We talk about the way we grew up, how similar they were and how different they were. Like I said, my mother-in-law now does not like to talk about the Holocaust. She doesn't like to talk about the war. She said it makes her very sad, where I grew up the complete opposite. I've explained to Steve that now as an adult, an older adult, there isn't a day that goes by. I know you said that you have nightmares. I don't remember a lot of my nightmares, but I can honestly say that there isn't a day that goes by that there isn't something in my work life or my home life that doesn't give me, and it's weird to say because I think you might understand this. I have flashbacks to the Holocaust, even though I never lived during the Holocaust. I have flashbacks to the stories of the horrible things my mother told me. I have flashbacks of visions of the visual creations that my mother put in my head about how things are, how things were. She told me a lot of wonderful things about my grandparents, how loving they were, and how my mother came from a very well-to-do family. They were raised by a nanny because my grandparents owned a business and they were upstanding in the community, and they were very well-to-do in the city of Warsaw. But the things that I remember most are the horrific things that I see on a day-to-day basis. If I walk down a hallway, I have a sense about me that I'm walking in a tunnel, or I'm walking in a barrack, or they're very real to me. I tell Steve about those things.
Are you doing anything to manage those traumas?
No, I just go through life one day at a time. No, I don't.
I want to let you know that you're not alone. So the first thing you should realize is it's not just you. So I think once you realize that you're not alone and that you have people who can help you, like me, and you can talk to me, you'll see that these things start to feel less heavy. And I can share with you a story offline about how I haven't had a nightmare since 2019. And I can share with you some of the reasons on how I got through it. So does Steve also have trauma that has been inherited by his mother?
No, because she never talked about it. From what I know, she never talked about it. And when I tell him about my trauma, he's a little surprised at the things that I've told him, because those are things that just have never occurred to him, because he hadn't heard the same stories that I heard. My mother actually was pretty famous in the Detroit area in 1979. My mother actually went to Germany to testify against her concentration camp leader in Mydonic. And there's a recent movie set of 3 discs out called the Mydonic Trials. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
No.
And I have the set here, and it's a set of 3 discs, and I bought it from the Jewish Historical Society to see if my mother was on it. So I do have the written testimony that my mother gave. She had to go to a psychologist for a year and a half to see if she would mentally and emotionally be able to make the trip. And then she went to Germany and she got up on the stand and she testified against her concentration camp leader. And then when she came back home, I took her to the Detroit Jewish News to be interviewed. And I ordered the tapes to see if she was on them. And unfortunately, I watched all 3 tapes. It was like 8 hours of taping and she wasn't on it. But the woman that my mother spoke of in her deposition, which I do have the written deposition of it, I got it translated, and the woman that my mother spoke of is on trial, and I saw her numerous times.
So how did you feel about reliving that through your mother's eyes?
That was very hard because I heard what other women said about her. And I heard the things that they said that she had done to them. And then I read my mother's words, and they were identical to the things that I saw on the movie. And I read them, and it didn't matter to me that I didn't actually see my mother. I didn't know what would happen if I actually saw my mother on my big screen TV, but I was hoping that I would. And it was very sad. I think that that's such an elementary word, but I think that that's the only word I could think of, is that I actually was able to put a face to the name that I had heard about for so many years, to the person that tortured my mother.
Did it lift any of the 800-pound weight that's on your shoulders after watching those films, to really kind of get the sense that you saw something about your mother's past?
It made it more real. It put it in a different light. It made me want to shout from the rooftops at all the people that don't believe that the Holocaust ever happened, that I can tell you that it did. You know, it was just a feeling of sorrow that it happened in my lifetime and that my mother went through it. But I'm glad that she came out of it on the other side. I don't know if it lifted any weight off of my shoulders. It just gave more compassion.
Since you watched it, have you still had similar nightmares?
Yes.
Are they reduced, or are they the same one?
They may have been a little bit reduced. I will say, I still think about her every day, and I still think about it every day. And I have her voice on video because she told her story, and our family has it on a cassette tape, and I still can't bring myself to hear her voice. So she's been gone 22 years, and I still can't bring myself to hear her voice.
I can identify with you, and we definitely will talk about this at a much deeper level.
It's hard.
We're getting close to the end of the session. I want to ask a couple more questions.
Sure.
Do you think that you've transferred some of the things that you're talking about to your children?
Well, I know that my children identify very strongly with their history. My mother passed when my daughter was in college and my son was in high school. So they do remember her. And my daughter has 3 children of her own now. And she named her children after, she named some of her children after my mother. And I know that her Jewish identity is very much intact. I don't know if that has anything to do with my mother, because it's so easy right now to go outside your faith. And the one thing my mother always told my kids was, marry someone Jewish. You have to prove that Hitler did not succeed. You have to keep our heritage going. My son lives in Minnesota. My son is actively involved in a 3G network that he began in his community, and the company that he works for. He's in the financial industry, and he does a lot of speeches. He does a lot of talks. He brought Anne Frank's stepsister, the one that wrote the book recently, to Minnesota and had her speak at an event that he was hosting. And he has a daughter as well. He has a child as well. So his Jewish identity is probably stronger than mine, if you will. He intends on carrying my mother's legacy on to anyone and everyone that will listen to him about it.
I'm going to turn this into a little bit of a more positive situation. So
Okay.
I'm going to talk about something that my parents used to do, which I call triggers. And I'll be interested to know if one of your parents or both parents have brought these triggers to you, and do you bring them to your children? I have one son. I definitely bring these to my son. So my mother, when I didn't want to eat, and I was really a terrible eater, she would always tell me that, I've cooked this terrific meal for you there, and you don't want to eat it. But there are people in China that would be happy to have this food. So please eat. My father would say all the time that, hey, would you please turn off the light when you're not in the room, because we don't have stock in the electric company. So I was wondering if you have some triggers that came through your mother and father. Well, you didn't know your father, but through your mother, that you can tell us.
Those two, yes. Money doesn't grow on trees. You can't have everything you want. If you went for it for this long without having it, you can go for it a little while longer without having it. And yes, I have passed those things on to my children. Yes. We're not feeding the whole neighborhood. We don't have stock in the electric company. Turn off the lights when you leave the room. I think one of the biggest things was obviously the food. But, my mother always said that when she came to America, she was told that, the money grows on trees. And she literally, since she didn't know the language, thought that people had money trees in their backyard. And you went out and picked a dollar bill off of it when you wanted to buy something. So, yeah, so she used to tell us money doesn't grow on trees. And I, of course, told my kids, you can't have everything that you want. You have to, but I think that those were good lessons I told my kids.
And are your kids telling their kids?
No. I don't know if my son does, because he's in Minnesota and I don't see them on a day-to-day, but my daughter is the complete opposite of me. Like, I'll keep leftovers until they're gone. My daughter will not keep leftovers. And the funny thing is, my daughter's husband is a firstborn child of Russian immigrants. And so his parents came to the United States in 1979 when
the Refuseniks came, yeah.
Right. And so my son-in-law is more like I am than my daughter. He will hide the leftovers from her before she can throw them out. Yeah.
So I'll leave us with this question. So what's on your bucket list, and what's on Steve's bucket list that you're, now that we're coming out of COVID, hopefully, and knock on wood, that's true. What are you planning to do on your bucket list? And what is on Steve's?
Steve's going to do whatever I tell him that we want to do. Steve's bucket list. Steve wants to go to Israel. He hasn't been to Israel since 1973. I was there for 3 weeks in 2016 with my sister. I would love for him to go. He has a first cousin there, and I would love for him to be able to see his cousin, but we won't go yet. But on my bucket list, I want to travel, but I don't want to travel outside the country. I'm more interested in seeing all the places in the United States that I haven't seen. We're very fortunate that we like to be cooped up in the car together and we don't get bored with each other. So I would love to have an RV.
Oh, I can't believe you just said that.
Why?
Myra, my wife, she on the cable station, there's a channel that's called RV Nation. Have you ever seen that channel?
I've heard of it.
And so she watches this, And as we go down the road and driving, she says, that's a 5-wheeler, that's a C-car, whatever it is. She knows every single RV. And one of the things that she's been talking about is for us to go, because of COVID, cross country, take the dog with us in an RV.
I would love to do that. I would love to. I have a retirement app on my phone for when I'm going to retire. I have a little bit over 2 years to work, and then I want to retire. I don't want to work. I mean, I may retire sooner than that. I don't want to work until to the point that I can't enjoy doing what I want to do. But I want to take, I have 2 dogs, take my dogs, take my husband, get in some kind of vehicle. I make him go to the RV shows, by the way, and look at all the RVs, and drive around and really see the country, see the place, go to the places, not just fly there. I want to see the places that I have never had the luxury of seeing.
And what is your occupation, and what are your 2 dogs? What breeds?
I have an 11-year-old black Labrador.
Oh, beautiful.
And I think they're both rescues. I think she's about 8 or 9, a puggle. So she's a pug and a beagle. She's supposedly a designer breed. I don't know about that. I got her from a rescue, but she's great. She's the best dog ever. So those are my 2 dogs. And I made a switch. I was in mortgages for 25 plus years. And I made a switch. I work in healthcare now. I work for a nonprofit that is Medicare, Medicaid waiver program to keep elderly safe and insured and at home in their own homes and keep them safe.
Very nice.
So the name of the company is PACE. It's an all-inclusive program for the elderly.
I think I've heard of
to
it.
keep them safe. So
I think I've heard of PACE.
yep.
So Bonnie, I want to thank you. It was such a pleasure getting to hear your story. And I want to have a conversation with you offline so we can share some mental health issues and help you with some of the learning that I have over the trauma that I experienced. So thank you for being part of the Obligations of Memory podcast, and we'll say good night. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We'll talk